The essence of this book revealed itself to me over the course of 30 years in a series of epiphanies, the last of them in Milton Friedman's glorious apartment high in the sky, with San Francisco Bay and the Golden Gate Bridge shimmering in the distance like a fresco of sea and mountains and heroic steel beams. It was an early autumn morning in 2006, and Friedman, the Nobel Prize-winning economist and ideological father of neoliberal economics, had granted me an interview at his home. 10 minutes into our conversation, he leaned back in his chair and offered this assessment. These last 25 years have been wonderful, truly excellent in terms of the global economy, he said. It's been a period in which you've had significant reduction in interference in trade, and the low inflationary environment has really created unprecedented opportunities for investment and innovation. It was 2 months before Friedman's death, at the age of 94, and as I sat and listened to him talk, I found myself contemplating this iconic figure before me. He was much more pleasant than I'd anticipated, engaging and modest, not insincere. That he was hard of hearing made him a somewhat sympathetic figure, and his blunt spoken manner and principled libertarianism gave the impression of a man who struggled honestly with the gravest issues of his day and settled on what he sincerely believed was the best possible solution in an imperfect world. I was struck by how nimble and energetic he was for his age, and how absolutely tiny he was, a sprite of a man barely breaking 5 feet in height. I was pondering the contrast between his physical size and his towering presence in the world, when a feeling of déjà vu suddenly washed over me. 6 years later, while reporting on the political unrest that had begun to surface in Zimbabwe, I had sat down for an interview with Ian Smith in the living room of his home in the capital city of Harare. He was 81 at the time, and I remembered thinking how small he was, not short like Friedman, but gaunt, his chest almost caved in. When I was a teenager and read about Smith in the late 1970s, I imagined him a colossus, the defiant Bull Connor of Africa, the prime minister of a country that had seceded from the British Empire and was known then as Rhodesia. As with Friedman, I had expected, wanted to dislike him. But he was, in our meeting at least, a rather genteel man, white-haired and frail, a recent widower who seemed genuinely hungry for company and spirited conversation. He replenished my coffee cup whenever it was empty, and he invited me to stay and talk longer than the hour we had initially scheduled for our interview. "This country has never seen such lawlessness and corruption," Smith said to me at the time. "Blacks come up to me all the time and say that they were better off when I was Prime Minister. We had a fine country then, a strong economy that was the jewel of Africa. Our blacks were the happiest in the world." Much of Smith's view seemed an alternate reality to me. So did Friedman's analysis of the global economy. For Africans living in Rhodesia, or for workers anywhere in the world, Smith's and Friedman's words would have been not just untrue, but untrue in the most absolute terms, or the complete opposite of the truth as they had experienced it. In the brilliant light of Friedman's apartment, it dawned on me that Smith and Friedman were, in a political sense, one and the same. Two leaders in the 20th century's twin imperialist movements, colonialism and globalization, the goals of which are one and the same: service to the empire and to their own social class. They spoke for their constituents and no one else. They saw no gray and did not want to. The world they built and lived in was wonderful, not in spite of what had befallen Africans or Chileans or U.S. workers, but because of it. On editorial pages, television news and public television, pundits, bankers, politicians, and professors often describe globalization as a train, inevitable, demanding, churning violently but ultimately necessary for civilization. But that all depends on your point of view. If you are lucky enough to have a seat on the train, then it seems all in all a rather good idea. But if you are on the tracks with the train bearing down on you, then the locomotive, from where you stand, is not all it's cracked up to be. If you own stock in the publicly traded company, then you cheer the stock market like the home team. But if you work for the publicly traded company and the stock price just jumped because you didn't get a raise, or 1,000 of your workers just lost their jobs, or your retirement plan was eliminated, then your view of the world in that moment is much less sanguine than Wall Street's. If your home is in foreclosure because you can't afford the usurious interest on your mortgage, then you think of better uses for $700 billion than bailing out a bunch of supposedly super smart rich guys who conspired to swindle you and your neighbors out of your hard-earned cash in the first place. From where Friedman and Smith sat on the train, Africa did fine under colonial rule, and the revamped global economy yielded extraordinary successes. Neither man's equation factored in ordinary people. Like colonialism, globalization is fundamentally extractive, a process of accumulation by dispossession, as David Harvey, an economics professor at the City University of New York, describes it. The difference between the two is minuscule. The stewards of colonialism demagogically rallied their countrymen against the communist menace. Globalization's architects found their own boogeyman, inflation, and used it to bludgeon the poor and the working class in the same manner. To the question of who gets ahead, the movements provide almost identical answers. Rhodesia's European settlers got from Africans free land and cheap labor to amass their fortunes. Their heirs, both biological and sociological, buy stocks in banks, peddling subprime mortgages. It is in the modern equivalent of the hut tax, the rich exploiting the poor for no reason other than to fatten their pockets. Through deregulation, the United States and scores of other countries opened the door for corporations to span the globe, shopping for the lowest labor costs and more customers. Privatizing state-owned industries and utilities generated huge profits for investors, but ate away at jobs and drove up the price of electricity and water. To curb inflation, countries like Argentina, Brazil, and South Africa have strengthened the value of their currencies, but in the process erased the price advantage their domestic manufacturers held over superior and often subsidized goods made in the United States and Western Europe. Foreign loans finance bridges, hydroelectric dams, and generators that largely benefit the country's elites, but saddle taxpayers with crippling repayments. Rising interest rates lower inflation, but make bank loans too expensive for working-class families who want to start a small business or send their children to college. Reductions in corporate taxes, soaring debt payments, and cutbacks in public spending wither credit unions, hospitals, schools, public transit systems, and land reform programs. Government transfers public property to private hands and private debt to public hands. The poor are left with no way out. The ghetto metastasizes even while Wall Street rakes in record profits. Globalization has inverted the relationship between economic growth and the living standards of the poor, and today's investors have assumed the role of landed gentry from the colonial era, cutting ordinary people out of the deal while they divvy up the booty among themselves.